Welcome today. I'm so excited to present our speaker today. This is part of our Legal Education for Elders seminar series. And today's presentation is Common Concerns in Long-Term Care. And our speaker today is Jody C. Moore. She's a founding partner with the law firm Johnson Moore. Jody primarily litigates cases involving claims of elder abuse and neglect in a nursing home or residential care facility setting, wrongful death, medical malpractice, and other catastrophic personal injury cases. She's dedicated to improving community safety through legal advocacy and is an accomplished lecturer on the topic of long-term care litigation to lawyer groups across the United States. So I'm really honored to have her with us today, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much, Jody.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here, especially because this is sort of in my backyard. I'm here in Thousand Oaks, and I've been litigating here in Ventura County my whole career. Born and raised actually in Santa Paula here in Ventura County. So I'm thrilled to be a resource and to be invited to speak to this audience today. Let me just start. It is difficult being in webinar mode because I can't see any of you, but let me just start a little bit with what you can expect over the next 45 minutes or so. As you heard, I'm an elder abuse litigator, so I represent patients, residents, and their family members when there's been allegations of neglect, abuse, or healthcare malpractice. My goal for the call today, however, is to educate a little bit about what we see as common fact patterns for elder abuse and neglect cases in the long-term care setting, so in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. And the goal of kind of telling you what we see going wrong is to then shift to the education portion, right? To talk about, well, how can we try to avoid being in the situation where neglect and abuse can occur? So that sort of second part of the conversation is going to be a little bit about what to look for, how to advocate, and what resources might be available to you so that you can, if you're assisting someone going through this journey, or you're looking at some facts and circumstances that maybe don't look right to you, you have a little bit more tools in your tool belt in terms of what you're looking for. And then in the end, we're going to leave a few minutes for questions and answers. So if you've brought specific questions today, I'll be happy to stay on the line and answer those questions. I do like to start off, though, and give you just a little bit more of a personal story, I guess, in terms of how did I find myself doing litigation involving elder abuse and neglect. I mentioned I'm born and raised here in Ventura County and went to law school. And shortly after law school, I got a job in a local firm that defended nursing homes. So I was on the other side. I was actually representing the nursing homes and the long-term care industry. And my grandmother got sick and she was hospitalized, and she had a surgical complication that she had a stroke that rendered her needing to go to a nursing facility. And so she ended up in this nursing facility, and I thought, I was a young lawyer. I had about 2 years experience as a lawyer. I was a young lawyer, and I thought, I'm going to do this right. I know the questions to ask. I'm going to meet the administrator. I'm going to meet the director of nursing. Our family is going to visit. I had my little business card. I like posted that over her bed with a little scotch tape. And I was like, essentially like, don't mess with grandma was kind of the vibe. And as you may suspect by how this story goes, she did not get treated very well. She did not have a good experience in the nursing home. We, as her family members, did not have a good experience in the nursing home. We had a lot of issues with pain management not being handled. And ultimately, she developed a pretty significant bed sore, kind of the size of a small dinner plate, which was not well treated, and which we didn't know about for a couple of days after it developed. So those were the kinds of things that I thought, by saying who I was and asking the right questions, wouldn't have happened to her, and they happened anyway. And it really caused me to question the idea that someone who was well cared for and visited and had advocates at her bedside still couldn't avoid sort of those those outcomes and the suffering that she had at the end of her life, it really occurred to me like, well, does anybody really stand a chance, right? Um, so I inherited $500 when she passed away from her will, and I opened the bank account of the law offices of Jody Moore, and I've been on the plaintiff side, on the victim side ever since. So that just tells you a little bit about what brings me here today, and that was in 1999. So I'm in my 25th year practicing law, Eldon elder abuse litigator. So let me just start there with that platform in mind with what is elder abuse. You know, elder abuse in California, there's a very specific set of laws that define what elder abuse is. California actually has a pretty robust set of laws that protect vulnerable people who are either elderly, which is 65 years of age or older, which does not sound that old, but that is the legal definition, or they're considered a dependent adult. So our elder abuse statute actually protects dependent adults, and that's defined as somebody who needs assistance with their activities of daily living. So you don't necessarily have to have a chronic disease or developmental disability or cognitive dysfunction to qualify as a disabled adult. Actually, our statute's broad enough to cover somebody who's just acutely hospitalized for a period of illness. So if I were hospitalized from, you know, a heart attack or a stroke or a broken leg or something like that for that period of time that I need assistance, I'm considered a dependent adult in our hospital system or in our nursing home system. So that's sort of who the law covers. And then the next question is, what does the law cover? And it covers neglect, physical abuse, or financial abuse. The bulk of my conversation today is really going to focus on the neglect and physical abuse. Maybe someday I'll come back and we can talk a little bit about financial abuse in more detail. It is under the same sort of umbrella act as our Welfare and Institutions Code protective laws that govern elder abuse. But I'm not really going to focus on the financial aspect for our talk. On the neglect and physical abuse aspect of it, there's two different statutes that apply. Oftentimes, people have some idea in their head what physical abuse is, right? You think about assault and battery, and we've had sexual assault cases. That's maybe a little bit more intuitive, but neglect is kind of hard to have a general understanding about. So it's codified in the law, and it essentially is the failure to take reasonable care or take reasonable steps to take care of someone who can't take care of themselves. And the most common fact patterns that we see is the failure to provide needed medical care, medical services, the failure to provide for personal hygiene, so continence care is really big there, or the failure to provide food and water. So we have nutritional deficit, so dramatic weight loss, dehydration, kidney failure, things like that. So anytime the situation that's going on can kind of fall into one of these three categories, there is an argument that there's a basis to find neglect. We talked a little bit about physical abuse, but it's under a different umbrella, so it has a different statutory scheme. But one of the big fact patterns that comes up under physical abuse, and I've got a few slides on it today, is sort of the overuse or the misuse of certain types of medication. So one of the things that we find as people age, and particularly if they're suffering from dementia, is that they can have behaviors associated with that. So they can have agitation, anxiety, wandering, being combative with care, refusing care, outbursts. Those behaviors can be commonly associated with dementia, and also just confusion in terms of being in a care setting, especially if they're newer admission to that care setting. And so what we see sometimes is that those behaviors are being managed with medications. And there is a right way and a wrong way to use medication. So I'm not going to come out and say, don't ever medicate for behavior. But there are very specific statutes and requirements that say if somebody has dementia and they have these behaviors, you have to follow the rules if you're going to prescribe these medications. So talking about informed consent, making sure that the family members, if they're consenting for these medications on behalf of the elderly person with dementia, making sure that there's actually a robust conversation around what medication is being ordered and why, and what the potential side effects of that medication would be, is really important. And I have a few slides on that too, so I'm kind of previewing that. The other thing that's sort of interesting about the physical abuse statute is it also includes the prolonged or continual deprivation of food and water, which may sound like, again, like who would do that? It's like, who would do that? But the way it comes up is dehydration and malnutrition and weight loss. And so we do see that being tracked. That's something that needs to be tracked in most facilities. How much are they eating? Are they taking in adequate nutrition? Do they have medical conditions that require them to take in more nutrition? Do they have fluid restrictions? Some people who have medical conditions where they can overload on fluid, but their kidneys can't handle that, or their medication requires that they be fluid restricted. We need to look at that. But the flip side of that coin is people who just forget to drink, or people who don't have the physical capacity to get out of bed to go get a glass of water, or the cognitive capacity to say, I'm thirsty, I would like a glass of water, oftentimes suffer from dehydration. And so there's really robust rules, again, in long-term care, that no one should be suffering from dehydration and malnutrition. One of their really big components of care when you place a loved one in a facility is make sure they get enough food and water. But unfortunately, we see that fact pattern coming up pretty commonly. So it's in the big three, I would say, for abuse and neglect cases: falls with fractures, falls with significant injuries, bed sores from not turning and repositioning and not keeping somebody clean and dry, and malnutrition and dehydration are really at the top of the scenarios that we see that come up over and over and over again. So here's kind of a slide about that. So what are we looking for when we're trying to determine whether or not somebody's having a problem in a facility? So I talked a little bit about some of this. I'm saying some of these terms with the assumption in mind that maybe there's some familiarity among this group with what I mean when I say bed sores, for example. But since I can't see you, I can't really tell if you're nodding along and following along. So I'll just give a little bit of information about it. As people age, their skin gets very thin and fragile. They lose weight, or they don't have a lot of muscle tissue and fat to protect the bony prominences, like on their hips. Oh, the light's turned off. This is where I have to stand up, turn the lights back on because I was sitting too long. There we go. So when you get prolonged pressure from not getting up out of bed and moving and repositioning, if you get prolonged pressure over the tailbone, the hips, the elbows, the shoulders, even the back of the head, the heels, those parts of the body that are laying in bed, that pressure actually makes it so that the blood doesn't flow there and the skin can break down and you can have a bed sore. And so we have a little picture of that here. I tried to pick something very sort of neutral, but that you could understand what's happening. Those bed sores, the societal standards, the professional standards say that they are preventable in most cases, unless the person's really like actively dying. So facilities have a requirement to put into place a plan to try to prevent the skin from breaking down like that. And it includes making sure that their diapers are clean, making sure that they're toileted, making sure that the mattress is the proper type of mattress, making sure they're turned and repositioned from side to side, making sure that if they have a wound, they get enough nutrition. We need protein to heal our wounds, so they have enough nutrition in their diet to heal a wound. So it's a complex system, but it's one that's really well known, so that the long-term care industry knows, number one, prevent them at all costs. And number two, if someone gets one, recognize it right away and treat it so it can be healed. When I'm talking about bed sores, I'm talking about the most severe bed sores that have opened up where the muscle and the bone are exposed and infection is setting in because of that area of the skin. those are more often than not, like 90, 95, 98% of the time preventable. So that's something to be aware of, because a lot of debate goes on about, well, at the end of life, they're inevitable. And the statutes don't say that. The statutes say pressure injuries are avoidable unless you did everything right. You care planned, you recognized, you put the interventions in place, and the wound happened anyway. And when we look at the cases, they didn't do all those interim steps. So you can't call it unavoidable or inevitable unless all those steps are taken. Same thing with falls. I'll be the first person to admit falls can happen in the elderly. In fact, falls at home can be a reason that someone needs to go to a facility for more oversight and protection. So again, we're looking at the case and we're analyzing, did they recognize a fall risk? And then did they take steps that were necessary to avoid or prevent that fall? And even if you can't avoid the fall itself, can you try to minimize the risk of injury? So did we put padding, almost like you would for a small child? Did we put padding on the nightstand? Did we put padding on the floor so that if somebody's falling, that it might break their fall and they might not have as significant an injury? So we're looking for all of that instead of sort of accepting old people fall, and therefore when this person fell, that was an inevitable consequence of aging or having an unsteady gait. We talked a little bit about unexplained weight loss. I think that one's a little more intuitive, but again, facilities have to be looking at your calorie needs and making sure that they're met. And if someone's not eating, then that needs to be explained to the family and to the physician. Hey, this person's in a calorie deficit. What can we do about it? There needs to always be a plan to address the risk of losing weight. And maybe it's changing a diet. Maybe it's bringing in home cooked food. Maybe it's trying supplemental shakes. Maybe it's a feeding tube. Maybe it isn't, but we're looking for the conversation to make sure that the conversation is happening to see if they were addressing the problem. Finally, like the last point here, what are we looking for? We're looking for that contact and communication with the doctor and the family in every case. I used to say earlier in my career, I still say it, but I'm a little more cynical now, but I used to say earlier in my career, like I would be out of a job if people could learn to communicate better. Because what I think the residents and the families really want is to understand what's happening with their loved one. And most of our fact patterns have something to do with, catastrophic outcome happened, the fifth fall with a brain bleed happened, or they went to the hospital and we found out they had a stage 4 bed sore and we didn't know. And it's the lack of communication and that sense of betrayal that actually becomes the foundation of the litigation. Because as a family member, you feel like I tried to make the best choice I could. This facility seemed like the right place. It was a difficult decision, but I thought my loved one would be safe there. And when something bad happens and the family's in the dark about it, or it comes as a shock or a surprise, that sense of betrayal is very real. Like you promised to take care of my loved one. I trusted you and you betrayed that trust. And so that's sort of the kernel, if you will, of a lot of litigation. And I think the antidote, which I know I'm telling you all the bad stuff first, what to look for before we get to some of the antidote, right? But the antidote to that is really establishing a rapport with the doctors and the facilities and the family so that everybody's on the same team and everybody's pushing toward the same, good outcome or resolution for your loved one. And the facilities who do that communication really well, they can still have falls and bed sores and medication errors, and it's not litigation because they were really trying or they were really communicating. But the facilities who lie or cover it up or don't have communication or don't tell the doctors or don't hold meetings, those are the ones who really get in trouble because the rules require them to do that, but also there's this frustration and sense of betrayal and shock. Okay, so I told you we were going to talk a little bit about psychotropic medications. I'm really hoping, again, for this audience that at the end of today, you have a couple of takeaways that are like very practical. And so one is kind of what to do if psychotropic medications are being recommended or tried, or or offered, and to kind of know your rights around them. So psychotropics, it's a mouthful. It's like, I've never heard that word before, right? But they're a very specific type of medication. They fall into these 4 categories. They're antipsychotic, antidepressant, anti-manic, and anti-anxiety. So what does that mean? Well, antipsychotic, those drugs have been around for a long time. They were developed to help people who actually were having psychotic episodes, that have psychological, psychiatric DSM diagnoses of, hallucinations or aggressive behavior, agitation, things like that. Haldol's been around for a long time. It's an sort of an old school first generation. Some of the newer medications are Seroquel and Zyprexa. And again, the way that these medications work is they're going to, well, I'm not a pharmacologist, but they interfere with the brain function, right, in a way that's going to try to manage those behaviors. The problem is twofold. One is they have something called a paradoxical effect. So sometimes an antipsychotic medication is given to try to quell or quash or minimize this behavior, and it actually exaggerates it. So we call that a paradoxical effects. Like, oops, we were trying to make it less and we actually made it more. My bad. And that's a known effect. And so just because somebody has a paradoxical effect doesn't mean they did something wrong, but it is something that the person giving the medication has to be aware of. And sometimes what we see is they sort of have this simmering behavior. They get the medication, the behavior goes up instead of down. So they just double the dose of medication. And the behavior goes up and then they double the dose of medication, right? It's like the medication's not working. They're getting worse and worse and worse instead of getting better. So you really, again, are looking for, is the medication effective? Antidepressants are very well known and used a lot in the population, but they have the same categorization as a psychotropic medication. So the same informed consent procedures apply. I skipped the second problem with antipsychotics. So I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to that. The second problem with antipsychotics is if they're being prescribed for somebody who has dementia, there's a black box warning on them by the FDA. I have a slide on that. I'm gonna see if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. So what that means is the FDA regulates all of our food and drugs, right? And some drugs come with a warning label on them, and they say, warning, right? If you take this drug, this bad thing could happen. Well, they studied the use of psychotropic medications with the elderly population and people who have dementia specifically, and they correlated that giving these medications increased their risk of death. Right. So they correlated it sufficiently enough that they put a black box warning on it. And it's been around since 2008. This is not new information. But what we have found is that that doesn't get disclosed in the informed consent conversation. So somebody says, mom's acting out, we'd like to give them a new medication. Usually the facility calls and says the doctor's ordered it. The facility says, well, if the family says, if the doctor ordered it, my loved one must need it. So go ahead and give it. And then they write that down as informed consent. It might be consent, but it's not informed. Okay. What they're consenting to is if the doctor said I need it, I guess I need it, right? Most of us aren't questioning that. Just like if the doctor says I need cholesterol medication, I guess I need it, right? So there's been a big push among those of us who do the work that we do to make sure that the rules are being followed for these medications, and that family members are actually being told of this increased risk of death, and that the medications are not being used essentially to sedate the person so they are easier to care for. And that is the improper use of these medications. Same thing with anti-manics and anti-anxiety medications. There's a right way and a wrong way to use them, but if they're used, there has to be special documentation in the chart that says informed consent has been obtained. So that's my primer on psychotropic medication. And again, I'm not entirely sure about the audience, but if somebody is under conservatorship, there's even more rules about whether a conservator can even consent to a psychotropic without a specific order from a judge. So there's an extra hurdle. That's how carefully these medications are being monitored, if you will, by either our judicial system or by Congress by enacting these laws because of the dangers associated with the medications. From a facility standpoint, I'm saying facility a little bit generically because we have, and I'm going to get to levels of care. We have the difference between a skilled nursing facility and assisted living. There's totally different rules that apply to them. So when I'm talking about these psychotropic medications, the special rules really only apply in skilled nursing. So a nursing home or what you might call a convalescent hospital, these special informed consent rules apply there, don't apply in assisted living in the same way. So you really want to be paying attention in a skilled nursing facility setting. Okay, so that is psychotropics. And I think I kind of covered this, but what the nursing home has to do before they use medication is they have to try less intrusive means. So the planning needs to say, well, we tried to redirect them, or we tried to take them to an activity, or we tried to feed them at a different time of day and see if that was the issue, or if they're combative, we tried playing music in the background. Or, I mean, there's a facility in Arizona that's sort of a test facility. It's like we bake chocolate chip cookies, and when we go to do something we know the person doesn't like, we bring them fresh baked chocolate chip cookies. And that's like, we dispense cookies the way other facilities dispense Haldol, right? It's like, oh, I'd be pretty happy to get my afternoon cookie, instead of being sedated. So I'm not saying every facility should be doing the cookie experiment, but that is one example of how alternatives to the behavior, alternative plans to deal with the behavior need to be tried at the facility level. And all of that should be documented before they go to drugs. We have common fact patterns. Someone's brand new admission, and the first shift they're combative, and the next shift they're on Haldol or they're on Seroquel for agitation. It's like you haven't even gotten to know the person. They're triggered from the transfer. They're triggered from being in a new place. They're triggered from being scared. So let's take a little bit of time to figure out what's going on and to learn the patient, and maybe interview their family and try to figure out their likes and dislikes before we go to medicating them. So really hypervigilance around the medication is kind of the takeaway here. And I think we talked about the informed consent. So some of you may get the PowerPoint, and so some of this information I just wanted to make sure was embedded in the PowerPoint for anyone who might be looking at this after the fact. All right, so that's phase one of my talk for today. I'll just pause for a quick second. If anyone has questions about that, put them in the Q&A, put them in the chat. We'll come back to them later. But that's really kind of what does the law define as physical abuse and neglect, and how might it show up in a care setting? I'll transition to levels of care. I find this fascinating. Sometimes I say, well, I'm going to talk about levels of care, and people say, well, what do you have to say that's more than like 3 minutes long? And I could talk about this for days. I think that if you think about it from a business standpoint, caring for our elderly at the end of the day is very big business. It's a booming population, and companies have figured out that there is a lot of money to be made here, and they've figured out that there's a lot of tax dollars, Medicare and Medi-Cal dollars being paid. And the industry, the long-term care industry is ahead of the game. They are they are measuring, they are proctoring, they are following every red cent. And so what does that have to do with levels of care? Well, we have to understand how different levels of care are getting paid in order to understand the motivation of the business model. Because the motivation of the business model behind how they're getting paid is directing who's staying in acute hospitals, how long can they stay there, once they leave, where do they go, who's paying for that, how long can they stay there, when does the payment source change, where do we go after that? Because a lot of the fact patterns that we see in this regard is they're being kicked out of the hospital too soon, and they're being sent to the wrong level of care. So their care needs are too high for the environment that they're going to. you can imagine, for example, I was talking about those wounds and how they can be kind of superficial, but they can also get really, really serious. And so if somebody has a wound that is exposing their muscle, right, in their backside, in their diaper area, right, and they're not continent, sending them home to their 85-year-old spouse may not be a good idea, right? It may not be a safe discharge because as much as I think we all want to be in our homes as long as we can, there isn't 24-hour care set up to make sure that that wound is clean and dry, that diapers are being changed, that the person is being turned and repositioned, that their medications are being given on time, and that the wound care itself, like cleaning out the wound and putting on the bandages, that all of that can be done. And what I see is the acute care hospital will make that discharge and they'll say, bring in home health. And home health will do the wound care. Okay. Home health comes 20 minutes a day, 3 times a week. Right. And so the wife in this fact pattern, this hypothetical I'm giving you, is on shift the other 23 and a half hours a day. Right. It's a recipe for disaster because something like a wound requires hypervigilance for it to heal. Someone who's at risk for falls requires hypervigilance to prevent falls and to promote safety. And so that discharge plan has to be realistic. It has to realistically take into account what someone receiving the person can or cannot do. So that's why I can talk about this for hours. So just know, if you go to the hospital, the hospital has a responsibility to ensure that there is a safe discharge. That's the hospital's responsibility, not the families, not the patients, the hospitals. And that means that they have to assess, where is this person going to go? What are their care needs? And what needs to be set up for that to work, be successful. If they can, they'll discharge you to skilled nursing facility if you have a skilled nursing need. So what is skilled nursing, right? Skilled nursing is typically physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, dietary management, or wound management. It could also be like a trach tube, IVs, any lines going into and out of the body. Typically that's a skilled need. And when you go in order to qualify to go to a skilled nursing facility, you have to be in the hospital for 3 days. People don't know that, by the way. So that's another little tip. There are some nuances and rules that might modify that, including it did get modified for a period of time during COVID because we were trying to get people out of the hospital. And if you have a Medicare Advantage plan, so you've assigned your Medicare benefits to a private company, they might have some different rules about that. But very generally speaking, there's typically a 3-day qualifying stay. And what we're seeing now is the acute care hospitals are not actually admitting you anymore. They're putting you in observation status. This is a really important question to ask if you have a loved one in an acute care hospital. You need to say, are they actually admitted? Or are they on observation status? I have a small anecdote about that because my father fell in December and he fractured his arm and he fractured his hip. And he was in the hospital for 2 days before they surgically treated the shoulder. And then he was there 2 days after that before he could go to rehab. And I do what I do for a living. So you can imagine there were a significant amount of conversations going on about taking care of my dad, right? And on day 3, when I said, I'd like him to go to XYZ skilled nursing facility, they said, well, he doesn't qualify because he's not an inpatient. And I was like, what? Are you kidding me? He's debilitated. He broke both his hip and his shoulder. He can't walk, he can't move, he can't bear weight, he can't take care of any of his own ADLs. He's been lying in a hospital bed for 4 days, but he's observation status. So it happened to me, it can happen to you. So you have to ask the social worker, ask somebody right away, are they inpatient status? And it affects whether or not Medicare pays for your skilled nursing if you have to go to skilled nursing afterwards. So that's my soapbox about that. Once you go to skilled nursing, typically Medicare pays as long as you are continuing to benefit from skilled nursing, but their reimbursement rate changes right around the 20-day mark. So what we see is everybody's doing well and they're getting their therapy and they're progressing and all the reports are going in the right direction until like day 19 and a half. And then you get the discharge notice. It says it's time to go. They no longer progress. So just keep that 20-day mark in mind and be asking questions about what is the discharge plan? Where is this person supposed to go after this? If you don't have services set up to take care of them at home, like my dad's a great example. He lived alone and he can't walk and he can't use a walker because his shoulder's broken. So he's wheelchair bound. There's nowhere for him to go. There's no household that will allow a wheelchair to get in and out of the doors. There's no one story, right? So we need to make sure that his discharge plan takes that into account and not just discharge to home. That's not going to work. Many times, residential care facilities for the elderly will be the place the person goes either next or instead of a skilled nursing. If they don't need the skilled nursing, let's say that fall risk, where they're falling, but they didn't fracture anything, but it's not safe to go home. Someone like that may end up in a residential care facility for the elderly. And again, residential care facilities fill this niche. They're really important to keep people in a home-like environment. But there can be overreach there too, which is sort of my next few slides. RCFEs are non-medical facilities. RCFEs are non-medical facilities. And so here we go. In non-medical facilities, they may say we have a nurse on staff, but they do not provide nursing care. They're prohibited from providing nursing care. So you have to think about them more like a daycare almost, where they're providing food and shelter. They're definitely providing like psychosocial support, activities, social working, scheduling appointments, and they're providing medication assistance. So they're going to make sure your loved one's getting their medications. And they have to notice if there's something going on, like a clinical problem, like the person's lethargic or they're stop eating or their urine is cloudy or they stopped urinating. They have to notice those things, but they don't have to respond to them like a nurse or a doctor would. Their duty is to respond by telling a doctor or telling the family there's been a change of condition. So two things that happen in RCFEs very commonly, again, is one, they meet a nurse who's like the wellness nurse for the facility and they think, they'll get nursing care, which is a whole bait and switch, so just know that that's not true. Even if there's a nurse on staff, no, they're not responsible to provide nursing care and nursing services. And the second thing that happens is there's a whole list of conditions that are prohibited in an RCFE, in assisted living. And the RCFEs oftentimes will fudge or ignore or maybe not assess somebody accurately so that they fall into one of those categories of prohibited conditions because they want to put the person in the facility because they get paid a cash price. Usually insurance, unless it's long-term care insurance, does not pay. Medicare, Medi-Cal, Blue Cross Blue Shield, none of that pays for assisted living. So it's a cash price. So they want the resident, so they're going to sort of downgrade what the resident's needs are to get them in the door. So that's sort of the next slide is what are the prohibited conditions in an assisted living facility. I'll put a star on this. Let me put a little asterisk on this. If someone's on hospice, they can age and die in place. So if someone's on hospice, some of these conditions are permitted, but the facility has to have a hospice waiver and the hospice diagnosis has to be legitimate. In other words, you can't wait for someone to get a bed sore, which is prohibited if it's a stage 3 or 4, and then call in hospice really quick and say, they have a bed sore, let's put them on hospice so that you can treat the wound. You can't do that. But if someone's legitimately qualifies for hospice, then they can age in place. So that's the caveat to this. But assuming they're going there, they don't qualify for hospice, they're not, within 6 months of dying from a terminal illness, which is the standard for hospice. They have a primary condition of dementia, probably. That's a very common fact pattern. Once they need any of these services, a G tube for feeding or a nasogastric tube for feeding, if they have a staph or serious infection, or if they're dependent for all activities of daily living, or they have a stage 3 or 4 bed sore, they don't qualify to be in an assisted living anymore. And they need to be transferred out to a higher level of care. So that's really a big deal, and it's something we look very closely at is do these wounds develop and progress to a significant stage in assisted living? If so, they shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be accepted in the first place, but they can't stay if it happens while they're there. The other thing that's really important about prohibited is you cannot be in an assisted living if your primary diagnosis is psychiatric. And we don't include dementia. Dementia is technically not psychiatric, it's a medical condition. So if you have someone whose primary condition is schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or some other, cognitive or psychiatric diagnosis, and they have dementia and they're elderly, their primary issue is schizophrenia, for example, they're not supposed to be in a boarding care assisted living. So that's a big problem because we have a lot of people with mental illness and we have a lot of people who are unhoused with mental illness. And so it's attractive to bring those folks into this type of care environment. But again, because they're not a medical model, they're not a nursing model, the care needs of somebody whose primary diagnosis is going to be psychiatric is too high for the boarding care. And that's where we start to see things like sexual assault, physical assault, one-on-one between residents, is when you have somebody who doesn't meet that criteria to begin with. So we're always looking for, is the primary reason that they're there dementia or some physical condition, heart disease, stroke, diabetes management, whatever that might be, or is the reason that they're placed there a psychiatric condition, in which case they can't be there. So that's this really important thing to know about them. We talked a little bit about hospice and that the facility must have a hospice waiver. And I'll just give my little pitch here. I kind of alluded to it. We see misuse of hospice when hospice is being used to keep someone in a facility that really shouldn't be there. So the terminal diagnosis, what is the terminal diagnosis, needs to be carefully evaluated to make sure it's not a pretext. It's not just, like I said, their condition became a really severe wound, so we'll just bring in hospice so we can keep them. The reason they can't stay is because healing a wound is a multidisciplinary 24-hour-a-day process, right? I told you that you need nutrition, you need a certain amount of protein and grams of protein in order for the tissue, the actual muscle tissue, to rebuild and grow. And there's no nutritionist in an RCFE, right? And then you need the specialty wound treatment. You need RNs and LVNs looking at the wound each day for signs and symptoms of infection. That doesn't happen in an RCFE, right? This assistance turning and repositioning and having a schedule and making sure that the pressure is offloaded, that's going to happen more carefully, more robustly in skilled nursing. And also doctors tend to round in skilled nursing, and they can order labs, and all of that blood work and monitoring for signs of infection happens a lot more readily in skilled nursing. So the reason is really that the model of care is not set up to take care of a more significant injury or illness. It's not some arbitrary line in the sand. It's that they actually need all this care that can't be provided in that care setting. Which kind of brings me full circle back to my very first slide when I said, what is neglect? And it's the failure to provide medical care, right? Here's how those two things interact, because in a residential care facility, they're actually prohibited by their license to provide the type of medical care that might be required for somebody to heal a wound. Yes, they can bring in home health, but again, because it's intermittent or sporadic, it may not be sufficient for that person's actual rehabilitation and recovery. So that connection with a doctor and really having a robust plan has to be part of the record, part of the actual delivery of care. I can't believe I'm running out of time. I feel like I'm talking so fast, so I will try to slow down. I will say, like, sort of don't forget the doctors in all this, right? At the end of the day, ultimately patients are under the care of their doctors. Doctors are very confused about the difference between these levels of care. And I try to give these talks actually as often as I can to doctors so that I can be like, hey, do you understand that you sent this person to an assisted living and not a SNF? Like they see, Manor Gardens in the like patient will transfer to Manor Gardens and they don't know if that's a SNF or an RCFE. They're like, oh, they're going to a facility. So let's just say they're not always as astute about the level of care that that I would want them to be, or that a family member might want them to be. So that's why the family member needs to be informed and be like, are you sure this is the right level? Are they going to get what they need at this level of care? One of my tips is befriend your doctor. Befriend them as best you can. Try to meet them face to face. Try to get them on the phone and introduce yourself, because one of the ways to advocate for your care is to just not be a widget, to not be a number, to be an actual face. So the people who have more robust relationships with their doctors tend to get better care. So that's a really important tip in terms of trying to maintain a healthy relationship in the facility, is befriend the doctor, befriend their staff, befriend their nurse, befriend their front office staff, whoever answers the phone. Make them kind of your best friend. I had to do that a little bit with my dad. Like I didn't like walk in with my lawyer robes on and hand out my business card. I was like, hi, I'm just trying to understand what's going on here with my dad, because I wanted them to talk to me, and I wanted it to be like we're on the same team and we're all here trying to make sure that my dad gets the best care he can get. And then, later when my dad was like, did you know she's a lawyer? They figured that out. So befriend the staff as best you can. So that's kind of this slide, right? How do we advocate for the best care that we can get? I did put on here, number one, like know your insurance and the benefits. And again, it's because I want people to have a little bit more of an understanding of that 3-day qualifying stay in the hospital, the inpatient status, how important that is, how long does your insurance pay if you go to a skilled nursing facility, because people are just miraculously cured on that 19th day. So having some understanding of that before your loved one goes to a facility is just, if nothing else, it's going to help you prepare as someone's been in a facility for a little while. How can they stay? There's also a lot going on with Medi-Cal, which is kind of beyond the scope of our talk, but skilled nursing facilities, if you are Medi-Cal eligible or you have Medi-Cal, once you're no longer qualifying for that skilled care that we talked about that Medicare might pay for, you default to Medi-Cal. If you qualify, you default to Medi-Cal. So they're not supposed to kick you out. They're not allowed to kick you out. They are supposed to take your Medi-Cal once your Medicare runs out. What they don't tell you is they give you a notice of Medicare non-coverage and they say Medicare is going to stop paying on, Tuesday. And then they're silent as to you can stay if you have Medi-Cal. They don't tell you that part. So there's this mad scramble to try to get your loved one home or to set up home health or whatever you might need to do, because that piece of, well, do they qualify for Medi-Cal, or they have Medi-Cal, or can they stay? Is sort of left out of the conversation. So that's why it's so important to know what are your insurance and what benefits are provided, so that you can kind of push back and keep somebody in the level of care that they're in. We talked about relationship with the doctor, frequent visits. Again, be a face, be a friendly face in the hallways, participate in care plan meetings. All skilled nursing facilities have to have care plan meetings, and if you're a representative for loved ones, you're supposed to be invited to attend, and you are welcome to attend. And there are rules that say that everybody who's involved in the person's care should be involved in the care plan meetings. So even just knowing that, you can start to ask, well, when is the care plan meeting, and can I be there for that? I put just a handful of research and resources on this slide just before we wrap up, just to know. Ventura County has an amazing ombudsman program. I don't know if any ombudsmen are here today, but anyway, we have a really robust and dedicated ombudsman program. If you don't know what ombudsman is, they're the liaison between the families and the residents in the facilities, and sort of the management and ownership structure. And also they liaison with the regulatory agencies, with Department of Public Health and Department of Social Services. So if there's a problem sort of simmering, or a piece of information that you're trying to get answered, and you don't want to call a lawyer, or it's not litigation, or you just don't know what to do, you can always reach out to the Ventura County Ombudsman Office, and they will help guide you through that process. Canner is a statewide organization. It's a really fantastic organization that does advocacy on behalf of residents and their family members in all kinds of settings, including assisted living, residential care, nursing homes. Their website is chock full of informational tips and tricks and questions to ask. And so if you're thinking about placing someone, or you have questions about your insurance, things like that, you will probably be able to find a fact sheet that kind of goes through what you need to know about all those different levels of care. So I would bookmark that. If you're actually looking for a facility, you can go to the Medicare website. This is going to track skilled nursing, not assisted living, but you can compare different skilled nursing facilities in your geographic region, and they'll tell you all about them, their ownership structure, and they have a star rating, kind of like going to a restaurant. Does it have an A in the window? You're looking for a 5-star facility. So at least it gives you some basic information. And finally, on that health insurance issue, we have another free local resource called HICAP.org, and they help people navigate what is the best insurance for them. So I know there's a lot going on between, do I stay on Medicare? Do I need a Medicare Advantage plan? Do I need a Medicare supplement? That can get very confusing, and it's somewhat individualistic in terms of what your medical needs are, what your medication needs are. And HICAP is an agency that you can schedule an appointment. It's totally free, and they'll walk you through benefits plans that suit your individual needs. So I highly recommend them if you have questions about your insurance. And I think I made it to the end of my planned speech. Oh no, my last tip. Sorry, I love this one. Okay, facilities want you to sign arbitration agreements. And arbitration agreements go against my very core as a human and an American and a lawyer, because what it means is you are giving up your right to a jury trial. And the pitch will be it's cheaper and it's faster to go to arbitration. 100% not true. When you go to arbitration, you're spending tens of thousands of dollars on a private lawyer to sort of oversee the dispute and make findings like a judge. When you go to the state court, it costs $465 and you have a judge. Okay, so all of the contracts that get signed on admission, you can opt out of pre-dispute arbitration. So opt out. That is my encouragement to you. And if you accidentally sign one, you have 30 days to rescind it. So you can always send an email, send a note, make a phone call and say, I want to rescind it. So that's in 30 days. But my favorite tip is if you're in a situation where you're preparing power of attorney for healthcare, which comes up very often when somebody needs end of life assistance making their medical decisions, you can just write on that form, my agent has all of the powers to make all of my medical decisions except binding arbitration. And then they don't have that authority, and then it doesn't matter what they sign, they don't have the authority. So that's another very practical tip that most people don't know about, because this arbitration provision is buried deep into a 47-page document, and now everything's electronic signature. So just be on the lookout for that, and know that you can opt out, and know that you can rescind it. And now I am at my questions page.
Wow, thank you so much. I did not know that you could opt out of the arbitration one, so I'm really happy to know that.
Yeah.
While you're still sharing the screen, if you don't mind going back to the slide on levels of care, because there was a lot of acronyms in that slide. And we have a question, if you can just explain what those acronyms stand for.
Yeah, I wish I had more time. I'm happy to stay on as long as you want to. So acute care hospital is like our traditional hospital, right? Los Robles, St. John's, Pleasant Valley. That's an acute care hospital. And LTAC stands for long-term acute care hospital. So it's like a Kindred facility, if you've ever heard of one of those, but it's where someone really has significant injuries, like they're on a ventilator, or they're paralyzed from like a motorcycle accident. So they have long-term needs. They can go to a long-term acute care hospital. A subacute is sort of another fancy name for that, but usually it's ventilator dependent or paralyzed individuals. So very high needs, but they're going to have those high needs for a long time. Rehab and SNF are fairly synonymous these days. Skilled nursing facility, SNF is the acronym for that. CLHF, CLHF. A lot of people don't have any idea what this is, but we do. When I talk about RCFEs or boarding cares, there's two kinds. There's the big ones that look like apartment buildings, right? And I'm trying to think of some here in Thousand Oaks, like University.
Atria.
Yeah.
Or
That's
Oakmont.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's like the big hotel style. But we also have boarding cares, which are like homes in normal neighborhoods, and they have 4 or 5 or 6 people. And they're technically licensed the same. And so those are also considered assisted living. Well, they took that model and they did it with skilled nursing. So there are private homes licensed for 4 to 6 people in very, innocuous neighborhoods that have these very sick people that would otherwise be in long-term acute care in their facility. So they're ventilator dependent, they're G-tube dependent, they're non-ambulatory, they're paralyzed, they're comatose, they're in persistent vegetative state, but they're in these home settings. And that has a whole host of problems associated with it because of the lack of oversight, and just you need a lot of human beings to take care of somebody who's that ill. And what we find is these homes have 1 or 2 people on staff, and it's just not enough. So that's what a congregate living health facility is. RCFE is the acronym in California that we use for assisted living. It stands for Residential Care Facility for the Elderly. So boarding care is the same thing. Assisted living is the same thing according to license, how they're licensed, but we call them RCFEs because that's what the statute calls them. Home health and hospice we talked about. Home health is, like I said, someone is coming to your house to do wound care, you can do therapy at home. You can do IVs at home. You can have your tracheostomy or a G-tube cleaned at home. That's home health. Distinguish that from home care agency. Home care agency is like a private sitter. So those are the people who are coming in, doing laundry, doing light housekeeping, meal prep, driving to doctor's appointments. They can do like shower assistance. It's that extra set of hands that you have in the home, but they're not licensed like a home health agency, and their aides are not licensed as certified nursing aides. They're more custodial. They're doing custodial assistance. So those are actually burgeoning right now. There's actually a lot of home care agencies that are coming up right now that have a private network of people they'll send into the home to provide sort of extra assistance. But the level of assistance they're providing, really, it's like duplicating me. I don't have any specific knowledge on how to lift and transfer, but if my dad was in my house, I'd do my best. There's kind of more like that. And then you have in-home private caregivers, which are, you can go on Craigslist and hire someone to come to your home. They're not affiliated with an agency at all. I don't recommend that. They're not licensed and bonded. They don't have training and all of that, but that's sort of from the tippy top all the way down to the bottom.
And if anyone is going to or is hiring somebody privately, directly, not through an agency, we had another seminar by a labor law attorney on what you need to know if you're going to become their employer. So that is recorded on our website, and I would definitely recommend watching it because it's the laws are very clear, and you have to be their employer. So that's important to understand too. Thank you for that. There's
Of course.
One other question, and then we'll finish up. Are there different wellness or safety legal health standards between private elder care at home versus in the facilities like SNF, boarding care, assisted living? Because I've seen and experienced this in the past with both of my parents.
I want to make sure I'm understanding the question, but because yes, there's the skilled nursing industry is very heavily regulated. And so when we talk about the regulation, right, those are the duties and responsibilities of the of the facilities themselves. And we have federal law that governs that because Medicare is federal money. And we have state law that covers that because they're operating in our state and they're probably taking Medi-Cal. And then we have sort of industry standards. What is expected as what is reasonable care under sort of the industry standards. And the nursing home industry is regulated. I think they said it's like regulated secondary to aviation, right? Because the population is so, it might be nuclear power plants. I mean, it's a lot. It's like aviation and nuclear power plants and nursing homes, right? Or like have similar regulations. And it's because the population is so vulnerable and the dangers of taking care of them is so high. And also because it's such a large amount of money passing through the system that there's a large amount of oversight. So everything's regulated in skilled nursing. It's less regulated in an RCFE, in assisted living. It's even less regulated in home health, right? As we go down, we see less and less regulation. And in-home private caregivers, if you're hiring off of Craigslist, for example, it's going to be those labor and employment laws that are going to regulate. But we do have regulations for home care agencies, home health, and home hospice. So you just have to match up the regulatory standard to the type of agency that's providing care to see what responsibilities are attached to them. But generally speaking, the higher on this list, the more regulation, the lower on this list, the less regulation. I hope that's answering the question.
Yes, absolutely. I think it did. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This was chock full of wonderful information, and I will send a copy of the PowerPoint to everybody who's on the call today, so you can take some more time to look it over. But I know I learned some new things, and I think the big message is that you need to be the best advocate you can for yourself or your loved one, and that does mean learning a lot about your insurance and what the rules are and what you can ask for and staying on top of it. So if issues come up and you don't know where to turn, the Ombudsman is a fabulous resource, and you can also call us at Senior Concerns. We do a lot of that, just talking it through, and don't take for granted what the facilities are telling you. If it doesn't fit for what your loved one needs, then just call us and let's find out if it's real or if you can advocate for something else. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope everybody here has a wonderful evening.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.